All right, so we're in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, page 247. The chapter title is With the Devotees at Dakshineshwar, part one. And just last week, we had a devotee bring up the age-old question. Every time there's a Q&A session, this question always comes up. It's always one of them. A devotee: I find it is extremely difficult for a householder to realize God. How few people can lead the life you prescribe for them? I haven't found any. Oh, here comes Ritu. So, yeah, I mean, this is a really valid point. It's like when you look around, you're like, where are the enlightened ones? Where are they? We live in a world of 7 billion, and we just never seem to run into them. And even if we do, quite potentially we don't realize that we have. Is probably part of the problem. But this notion, where are the realized people? And really what it speaks to is not so much the scarcity of realized people, but the scarcity of people who are willing to lead a life that takes them to realization. We're very distracted, especially these days, and we've got our likes and our attachments and our comforts and our things that we consider to be part of our lives, and we're going along. And realizing God is learning something in a radically different way. It's not using your senses. It's not using your mind. It's separating yourself from all of those things into a different portion of yourself that we're not often introduced to or even aware of inside, because we haven't really paid too much attention to the inside, oddly enough. And the senses provide such a constant changing story of excitement and pleasure and pain and wonder and confusion. So it gets all of our attention, and it's hard to pull out of that. So it's really more about just our own confusion and sometimes just flat out unwillingness to do what needs to be done. But let's look at what Thakur says here, what Ramakrishna says. He says, why should that be so? He's realized God several times over, as we know from his practices in the Great Master. He practiced the world's great religions until he came to the same conclusion in each one, which was realization of the divine. He says, why should that be so? I've heard of a deputy magistrate named Pratap Singh. He's a great man. He has many virtues, compassion and devotion to God. He meditates on God. Once he sent for me. Certainly, there are people like him. So Ramakrishna is saying, no, don't say that. There are people who are realized. You may not know who they are, because one of the characteristics of being realized is you've really lost your sense of ego. You've lost your sense of I, and so you wouldn't run around, hanging a placard on your sense of I. I'm realized. I've seen God. It would be normal and carry on your life as you are. So he's telling us, well, perhaps you're just not seeing them. Perhaps you're not recognizing them. The practice of discipline is absolutely necessary. Okay, so now he's hitting on something a little closer to home. We have to discipline ourselves, right? Why shouldn't a man succeed if he practices sadhana, if he does his japam and his meditation and his prayers, his singing of the names of God, and his finding a supportive sangha and listening to his teacher? Why shouldn't it happen? It happened for him. It's happened for many. And so why shouldn't it happen for you? And I often talk about really training ourselves to have that sort of expectation, because our karma writes our story. And if one of the lines in our story is, oh, I'll never realize God, or this is so hard, I'll have to do it in my next life. If we make that a part of our story, then that's the story you have to play. That's you determined this. Holy Mother, again, I remind us always, says you can have your realization this very moment if you want it. And so this is always a task for us to be aware of, that our lack of realization is not a third party problem. It's not somebody standing on our head saying, no, you don't get to. It's us saying later, being very interested and very devoted, but later. We'll do that. We'll grow into that. That'll fall away later. That habit will stop later. And so by doing that, we basically sign up for ordinary life until we're finished playing. That's what Mother says. She says that as long as the child is happy playing in the toy room, the mother will go on about her business. But as soon as the child is done playing and puts the last toy down and cries out for its mother, the mother will run from wherever she is and pick the child up and take her in her arms. And so that's all that the divine person is waiting for you to throw down your toys and say you've had enough, and that you want nothing more than to come home, or to have your realization. And at that point, it's yours. So he says, why shouldn't a man succeed if he practices his sadhana? But he doesn't have to work hard if he has real faith in his guru's words. Faith is this knowing something to be true. When the teacher tells you, thou art that. I asked Swami Prabhupada about that teaching one time. I think it's in the Vivekachudamani or the Vedanta Sara, one of those two, where it has the description of the perfect student. And it goes through, he should be well versed in the Vedas, he should be well versed in the Upanishads, he should be a man of self-control and steady wisdom. It lists all these things, and I looked at Ramakrishna, I looked at Swami Prabhupada, and I said, Maharaj, that's a crazy list. I said, if a student had all of that, what's there left to learn? He's not even a student anymore. He's a teacher. And of course, Prabhupada said something very appropriate to me. He says, yes, he says, that is true. He says, you have to understand, he's talking about the ideal student. And he says, the ideal student only needs to know one thing. And when that teacher leans over that ideal student's shoulder and whispers in his ear, thou art that, the perfect student immediately goes into samadhi and has this realization, because he has already cleared all of the delusion. He's done all of the dehypnotizing work of preparing the mind, and all he has to know is what the truth is. And when the truth falls into a ripe mind, it immediately catches hold, and the realization happens at that point. And so that's what he was saying. He was saying, for us, we have so much, it's not that realization is difficult, because realization is just by the definition of the word, it means that you already have what you're seeking for, but you haven't realized that you have it. We've talked about why that is, because we put our sense of identity in mind, and we identify ourselves based on the outgoing senses. We describe ourselves from the outside in, and that's who we think we are. And that's the problem. We have wrongly identified ourselves, and so the whole world looks askew because we've got colored glasses on. And so we have to move our sense of identity out of mind. We have to silence the mind, and we have to move it into the heart, into the shrine, the absolute unchanging that's within us, the silent self. And in that silence, we become aware of all of these things, but not through senses, not through senses. So he says, but he doesn't have to work hard if he has real faith in his guru's words. Once Vyasa was about to cross the Jamuna River, when the gopis also arrived there, wishing to go to the other side. The gopis were all of the women devotees of Krishna, the milkmaid ladies, who had deep devotion, great love for Krishna. So they wanted to go to the other side, but no ferry boat was in sight. They said to Vyasa, "Revered sir, what shall we do now?" "Don't worry," said Vyasa. I will take you across, but I'm very hungry. Have you anything for me to eat? Well, the gopis had plenty of milk, because they were milkmaids after all. The gopis had plenty of milk, cream, and butter for them, with them, so Vyasa ate it all. Then the gopis asked, well, sir, what about crossing the river? Vyasa stood on the bank of the river Jamuna and said, O Jamuna, if I have not eaten anything today, then may your waters part, so that we may all walk to the other side. No sooner did the sage utter these words than the waters of the Jamuna parted. The gopis were speechless with wonder. He ate so much just now, they said to themselves. And he says, if I have not eaten anything, ... Vyasa had the firm conviction that it was not himself, but the Narayana who dwelt in his heart, who had partaken of the food. All right, that's what we're talking about. You see, Vyasa had already done all of the work of separating out his identity from body-mind. So when he says, I'm hungry, he's talking about his higher self. He knows that he is not identified by body. And so to feed the body was not to feed himself. And he knew this absolutely. So he could stand up and say, if I have not eaten anything today, let the river part for me. And we're quite surprised by these things. It seems like all the world's scriptures have these quite outrageous stories: rivers parting, seas parting, mountains moving, food falling from the skies, all of these different stories of faith. And, we live in a time where faith is not so great. Not very many people have a deep, abiding faith, a deep faith based in knowledge, and not just a shallow belief in a philosophy or an ideal in their mind, but really something that has been integrated into their self. And we see that this is the secret here for Vyasa. He's understood his nature, understood who he was, so he knows who he's working with. He knows what the game is, what the scenario is, and he knows that this world is dreamlike, and that if a man has faith the size of a mustard seed, really not that much faith, but just a very secure faith. Jesus said, take this mountain, tell it to throw itself in the sea, and it will do it. And so he's doing the same trick here, but instead of throwing a mountain in the river, he's asking the river to stop flowing for a moment so that he and the gopis can walk across. Shankaracharya was a Brahmagyani, which means a knower of God, a realized soul, to be sure. But at the beginning, he too had the feeling of differentiation, this feeling of being separate and apart from the whole. So you see, which is what happens when we identify ourselves from the outside in. We become separate, we become particular, and we break the world. Well, technically we break it into two, but we actually break it into many, many, many pieces, because that's the way it appears when we wrongly think ourselves to be a particular, the body-mind. And when we see ourselves as a body-mind, we look around and we see everybody else as a body-mind. We don't see spirit, we don't see soul, we don't see the divine, we see bodies and minds. And what are bodies and minds interested in? Food and comfort. And so we interpret the world according to notions of food and comfort, desires and aversions. And that's what causes us to not be able to see properly. So Shankaracharya was a Brahmagyani, to be sure, but at the beginning, he too had this feeling of differentiation. He didn't have absolute faith that everything in the world is Brahman, is God. One day he was coming out of the Ganges after his bath, and he saw an untouchable, a butcher, carrying a load of meat. Inadvertently, the butcher touched his body. Shankara shouted angrily, "Hey there, how dare you touch me?" "Revered sir," said the butcher, "I have not touched you, nor have you touched me. The pure self cannot be the body, cannot be the 5 elements, cannot be the 24 cosmic principles." Then Shankara came to his senses. Once Jadaparata was carrying King Rahugana's palanquin, and at the same time giving a discourse on self-knowledge. The king got down from the palanquin and said to Jadaparata, "Who are you, pray?" The latter answered, "I am not this, not this. I am the pure self. He had perfect faith that he was the pure self. This notion. And this is an interesting thing because we run into a very similar story with Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj. Again and again, the questioners ask in his book, the book titled "I Am That," ask him again and again, well, how is it that you're realized and we're not? Can't you do anything for us? And he said, the only difference between you and me is when my teacher told me that I am that I am the universal, I believed him. You believed you still had a couple of things to figure out. And so it's just that absolute faith, that absolute knowing, letting go of all forms of identification, all forms of what they call attachments. Attachments means that you've taken your sense of I and have attached it to a thought or an object as being either a result of a desire of yours or something you like about that thing or something about that thing that is intimate to you. Anyway, you've defined yourself by it, right? If you want to know what your attachments are, if you're not sure what they are, I always tell people, well, write your online dating ad. That will show you quicker than anything what your attachments are. Oh, I like romantic walks in the sunset and the beach. I like movies and holding hands. whatever your attachments are, they'll come to the surface that way. And if you ever want to know what you really are, write your obituary and write the things that you want to be remembered for, and then you'll find out what your nature is.
So what would a holy man's ad be?
He wouldn't be advertising for a partner.
I know. If he was.
Well, probably very similar to what this man said. Not this, not this. I am the pure self. So he would probably write something like that. I'm not interested in walks. I'm not interested in anything that changes. I'm ever free, ever pure, ever blissful, happy in myself, fulfilled without necessity. I am he. I am the pure self. That is the conclusion of the Gyanis, the knowers. But the Bhaktis, the lovers of God, the devotion folks, say, the whole universe is the glory of God. Who would recognize a wealthy man without his power and riches? But it is quite different when God himself, gratified by the aspirant's devotion, says to him, you are the same as myself. Suppose a king is seated in his court, and his cook enters the hall and sits on the throne and says, O king, you and I are the same. People will certainly call him a madman. But suppose one day the king, pleased with the cook's service, says to him, come, sit beside me. There is nothing wrong in that. There is no difference between you and me. Then, if the cook sits on the throne with the king, there is no harm in it. It is not good for ordinary people to say, I am he. The waves belong to the water. Does the water belong to the wave? This is a wonderful little insight here. And it shows you that marriage between Gnana and Bhakti. It shows how they are the same thing, just being described in a different way based on the dispositions of the practitioner. For the Jnani, it's, anything that's not the ego self is other, right? And that other in its totality and more is this divinity, unnamed, indescribable. It doesn't get a personality, it doesn't get a will, it doesn't get anything assigned to it. It's just the isness, the being that they're going for. And that we have to transcend our egoism, which is blocking our view of that. The ego is what happens when the universal self comes in close proximity to the mind. It attaches to it, and that attachment to that local mind then empowers the local body, and that local body and that local mind then become the full identity of that entity. And that's egoism. We forget that we are this undefined, infinite, ever free um, isness, in that
Swami,
that lies. Yes. Uh-huh.
okay. This seems very clear to me. It is not good for ordinary people to say, I am he.
Right.
Now, am I not an ordinary people?
Yes, you are. Me too.
So why are we doing this other thing? Why are we running around saying I am he and trying to be like,
Who's running around saying I am he?
well, like that teacher you talk, the students of that Nishigarta.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
isn't
even
that Jnana Yoga? Isn't that people that are
no,
non-dual?
no. Jnana yogis go around saying not this, not this, not this, not this, not this. They'll identify with I am, with their own isness, their own being. But it's not a good practice for anybody who still sees objects to practice I am he. And the reason for that is that an ordinary person like you and I, we don't know what I means. We associate our I with the body mind. So we don't know what I means, and we don't know what he means. We don't know what God is. You know, we have
Isn't
wrong images of both.
Swami? Isn't so hum? I am he.
Yes, and that is the ultimate truth. That's the realization, but that's not the practice.
So isn't that a recommended mantra? So
No,
hum. Okay.
yeah, no. It can be a mantra for a very advanced soul, for someone who has effaced their ego already, somebody who knows the sense of I, to not be body mind, not be particularized. That person could use that, but that's at a very late stage in practice. And it would only be when your guru tells you of his own accord, do this. Now
Okay.
it's now it's time for you to do this. But until then, we shouldn't do it because we have a wrong idea of I and we have a wrong idea of he. And the damage is that we attach the qualities of what we call God to ourself, right? And if we attach it to ourself, then we start to get a sense of license. Well, if I'm he, heck, I can do anything I want. It's trivial. I'm not the body. Let's go ahead and entertain it. I'm not the mind. Let's go ahead and nurture it. Let's do whatever we want. So
Thank
that's what happens out of it if we do that. All right. So he's just saying, that's not. We should remind ourselves that we are ever free, that we're ever pure, we're ever beloved of God. Because we want to break our story. We want to diminish our ego story about what we are. So it's all right to remind ourselves of our divine attributes. That I am pure love. I've never been born. I've never died. So you can do things like that. And Vivekananda encourages that. It's just not the direct equating between me and God. Until the mind reaches a certain level of purity, has had this ideas of me and mine removed from it, then it can do it. And this idea, and that's what he's saying here when he gives this story about the person, if the cook just wanders into the throne room and sits in the king's chair and says, I'm the same as the king. We're both divine. I can sit here. He's going to get himself in trouble. Why? Because the ego has set him in that chair, and his ego has expanded to think himself to be the same as the king. And so the king's going to not be very happy and is going to have to do some elimination work to break that guy's ego down. And you can see this you can see this manifested in a video that I've shared before, where the Pope is giving a lecture in a big auditorium, and they have a big throne sitting behind the microphone that he's talking into, that he's not sitting in at the moment while he's talking. And some young boy, probably 5 years old, breaks loose of his mother backstage, apparently, and wanders out onto the stage while the Pope is giving his talk. And he wanders over to the chair and climbs up, with great effort into the chair. So this little tiny 5-year-old boy's sitting in this big, big throne, and security doesn't come out. Nobody's bothered. The Pope hears the audience chuckling, So he turns around and sees the young man sitting in his chair, and he also smiles and continues. Why? Because that child, by nature of being a child, has already reached the purity, or already owns the purity, the freedom from ego that we would need. If that child had marched out there and sat in the chair, he would have gotten a good spanking and would have been dragged off the stage. But because it was purity all around it, he could walk and sit in the Pope's chair and be chuckled at, be appreciated, because he was pure, because his sense of he didn't sit there out of a sense of entitlement. He just saw a chair. It was a nice chair. I'll sit in it. He didn't see the Pope's chair and think that he was worthy of it. So this is what we're talking about. This sense of I, this polluted by the ideas of me and mine, that's what we do our practice for, to try and root those out so that we can get unstuck from mind and find our natural position within ourself, which is in the heart. And when we're in that space, there's none of that arrogance. There's none of that sense of entitlement. There's none of that adopting of attributes. You no longer measure yourself by how well you're doing or how good you're doing. You measure yourself by the love of God. And in that, nobody is wanting. Nobody is less than. And so in that love, we find the ability to be free of egoism, which then allows us to sit in the throne with the beloved at his invitation. And then we know, and he knows, and all is well. The upshot of the whole thing is that no matter what path you follow, yoga is impossible unless the mind becomes quiet, right? And the only way that the mind becomes quiet is through the removal of me and mine. You've got your two little fingers of me and mine are what stirs up the water of the mind and prevents us from seeing unity. All right. So yoga is impossible unless the mind becomes quiet. The mind of a yogi is under his control. He is not under the control of his mind. So see, we have to withdraw our attachment to mind, our attachment to particular thoughts and ways of thinking. We have to understand that our thoughts do not belong to us, that they just happen. They're not even related to us. They're just going on, and we allow them to go on. We don't get interested in them. We live spontaneously from our nature and not through calculation from our mind. That's what we're trying to do. When the mind is quiet, the prana stops functioning. Then one gets kumbhaka. One may have the same kumbhaka through bhakti yoga as well. The prana stops functioning through the love of God too. In the kirtan, the musician sings, Nittaya Amar Matam Hati. Repeating this, he goes into a spiritual mood and can't sing the whole sentence. He simply sings Hati, Hati. Then the mood deepens and he sings only Ha, Ha. Thus, his prana stops through ecstasy and kumbhaka follows. Samadhi, that bliss of oneness, that bliss of love, when we experience our nature, our isness. And so we have to work on becoming observers of mind, through Gnana Yoga. That is by looking at everything and saying, no, I'm not that. I'm not the body. I'm not the mind. I'm not that. And we keep backing up through negation until the only thing left is isness, right? And we come to our understanding. Suppose a man is sweeping a courtyard with his broom, and another man comes and says to him, hello, so-and-so is no more. He is dead. Now, if the dead person was not related to the sweeper goes on with his work, remarking casually, oh, that's too bad. He's dead. He was a good fellow. The sweeping goes on all the same. But if the dead man was his relative, then the broom drops from his hand. Ah, he exclaims, and he too drops to the ground. His prana has stopped functioning. He can neither work nor think. Haven't you noticed among women that if one of them looks at something or listens to something in speechless amazement, the other women say to her, what? Are you in ecstasy? In this instance, too, the prana has stopped functioning, and so she remains speechless with mouth agape. It will not do to repeat merely, I am he, I am he. There are certain signs of a Jnani. Narendra has big, protruding eyes. Swami Vivekananda had those big, wide, glassy, beautiful eyes. He also has good eyes and a forehead. All right. So, do we understand everything he's saying there? It's like, it's this. If you have thoughts going through your mind and you're detached, then you see them like the sweeper, when the thought wasn't related to him, when he knew that it had no relation to him, he accepted it, non-resistance, carried on with his sweeping, unperturbed. But when we have an identification with a thought, oh, that's my thought, then that thought brings in related thoughts, right? And then the crowd of thoughts then stand around us and sing to us about who we are and what we are. And we stand in the middle of it, enjoying it all. So in that sense, then that's one lesson that you can get from here. And then the other is just how, when you know your true nature, if you want to look at this parable just slightly different and say that when somebody says thou art that, but you don't have any identity with that universal self, no knowledge of that universal self, you say, oh, that's cool. I like that philosophy. That works. But there's not, your life carries on, your samskaras, your karma, your life, day-to-day life just carries on the same. But if you've done the purifying work, you've become the perfect student, and your teacher then whispers in your ear, thou art that, then the broom drops, the mouth is agape, ah, ha, 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 ha. And there's the sweeping may go on, but that power of that truth delivered by a realized guru to a pure heart, to a pure mind, sets the process to finished in a split second. It's right there. So he's saying, that's why it's not enough just to say it for us, because we live in our mind, first of all, and we only live in our shallow mind. We're not aware of all of our prayers that we pray in a given moment. We have many desires inside that affect our actions, and each of our actions and each of our thoughts are a prayer. Each of our words is a prayer. And most of our thoughts and actions and words are delivered thoughtlessly, rather freely, without much consideration. And so we're not fully aware of how we pray with our life. And so we get answers to those prayers, not even knowing that we've prayed them, which is why we're stuck, which is why it seems so difficult for us. But if we could unify our life so that somebody watching you live through the day would be like, wow, look, the most important thing in that person's life is love and service. Look at that person. The most important thing to them is their practice, their love of God. What a stillness follows them around. That's how somebody used to speak of it. It's how people talk about Swami Prabhupada. The number of times I heard somebody say, my God, he's like a rock, immovable. He has such a profound silence around his character. These are the signs of a realized or a knower. All men are by no means on the same level. Exactly. We're all working on this in our own place, in our own way. It is said that there are 4 classes of men: the bound, the struggling, the liberated, and the ever free. It is also not a fact that all men have to practice spiritual discipline. All right. So of those 4 groups, so the bound are the folks that they're just so caught up in the world. They're not interested in anything philosophical or spiritual. What a waste of time. That's for babies wanting to imagine imaginary friends and whatnot. So there's no interest. The world is as it is. Use generally materialist sort of perspective. Their life is about accumulation, about power, about relationships, about pleasures, who knows? But it's all having to do with the front end, the senses and the body mind. And then we've got the struggling. And that's probably most of us, it's like we've heard these truths, we believe these truths. Well, we may even have had tastes of experience that have pointed at these truths. And yet we've just got these habits that we can't shake, these little loves of pleasure and these loves of comfort and these loves of all different types of things, in and of themselves harmless. It's not that there's evil and wrong and all of that. There's helpful and unhelpful. Even in the Christian New Testament, St. Paul says that. He says all things are lawful. It's not that some things aren't allowed. It's not like that. That's not what it's about. He says, but not all things are helpful. Right. And so in spiritual life, for us, those of us that are struggling, we're trying to stick with the helpful things and to drop the things that aren't helpful. But some of those things that aren't helpful are very colorful and make very nice sounds and have very good feelings around them. And so it's very hard to let go of those. And so if we're not willing to let go of them, then the mind won't be quiet. The mind won't be quiet because you've put your me and mine in the middle of it. And the mind in its essence knows, this is why it's called realization. It knows its nature as one without a second. It knows that. And if you believed yourself to be that all the way down, then there'd be no problem. The mind would function as a mind should, which means it's silent until it's needed to be used, until it's needed to be used. Then it gets used. And then when it's finished doing what it needs to do, it sits in silence again. So the mind is like a butler to you. It sits there in quiet, waiting for you to need it. And then it does what's needed, and then it's quiet again and waits. So that's a healthy mind. But most of us, the mind is going all over the place. We've got 19 different lines of plans and thoughts and anxieties and worries and responsibilities and likes and dislikes. And so the mind simply cannot be. So that's the struggling. Those are the folks. We know we've heard the truth. We've got a good idea that it's true, and we're just struggling to get the mind to the place where it can accept the payload. The liberated, those are the folks who've had the realization. They know their nature. They've done the work. And then there's the everfree. Now there's a very few of these. These are the folks that came back to the world on purpose, so that they had their realization. Well, I guess you could say that. There's actually another thing. Mother's kind of putting something in my mind there. These are more the avatars. The everfree have never really been bound. Any level of binding that they've experienced has been by their own deliberate choice in order to stay in the body, to stay in their egoistic perspective, so that they can teach, so that they can free the rest of us who are struggling to get along. So those are the 4 classes. And the first 3 classes, we have to work. We have to do these practices. But he says, it is also not a fact that all men have to practice spiritual discipline. There are the everfree, these ones who are born with the knowledge of who they are. Some realize God after much spiritual austerity, and some are perfect from their very birth. Prahlada is an example of the everfree. Eternally perfect sages, like Prahlada, also practice meditation and prayer, but they have realized the fruit, God vision, even before their spiritual practice. They are like gourds and pumpkins, which grow fruit first and then flowers. Right? So they have a knowing, and they practice out of the joy of practice, the joy of being in oneness, which is what their practice is about. And so they'll do their practice, but not to achieve. They'll do their practice because of the is, the reality of it. Looking at Rakal's father, Ramakrishna says, even though an eternally perfect soul is born in a low family, still he retains his innate perfection. He cannot do anything else. A pea germinating in a heap of cow dung still grows into a pea plant. Right? So this realized soul, this ever-free soul, and the person who's realized God, they're no longer affected by conditions and circumstances. Their full identity comes from within themselves. And that's why the Gita calls them the people of steady wisdom, right? So that they're not caught up in things. If something seemingly bad happens, they absorb it as if it was nothing. There's no resistance toward that. They accept everything as being as it should be, right? In that sense. And anything that comes at them, they don't react to it. They respond to it from their knowledge of who they are, from the knowledge that they are pure love, unconditioned love, that they are pure grace, pure wisdom, and blessed with the greatest gift of existence, of being. And so they see that and understand that. So even though an eternally perfect soul is born in a low family, still he retains his innate perfection. He cannot do anything else. A pea germinating in a heap of cow dung still grows into a pea plant. God has given to some greater power than to others. In one man you see it as the light of a lamp, in another the light of a torch. One word of Vidyasagar's revealed to me. Vidyasagar was this great man that was a teacher, and Ramakrishna went to speak with him. One word of Vidyasagar's revealed to me the utmost limit of his intelligence. When I told him of the different manifestations of God's power in different beings, he said to me, "Sir, has God given greater power to some than to others?" At once I said, "Well, yes, certainly he has. If there are not different degrees of manifestation of his power, then why should your name be known far and wide? You see, we have come to you after hearing of your knowledge and compassion. You haven't grown two horns, have you?" With all his fame and erudition, Vidyasagar said such a childish thing as, "Has God given greater power to some than others?" The truth is that when the fisherman draws his net, he first catches big fish like trout and carp, and then he stirs up the mud with his feet, and the small fish come out, the minnows, mudfish, and so on. So also, unless a man knows God, minnows and the like gradually come out from within him. What can one achieve through mere scholarship? All right. So this difference in power, you see, we are of the same nature as Jesus or a Buddha or a Rama or Ramakrishna or the Divine Mother. We are all of the same nature, there's no doubt. We are all made of clay, as the example goes. But there's a difference between a clay mouse and a clay elephant, the amount of clay that's in them. So yes, we are all God for sure. There's no doubt about that. In that sense, we are all the same. But the measure of God that's manifested in us is different. For me, where I'm at, a great deal of my ego still manifests. A great deal of my personality still is the point of when people get to know me. They still see this person that way, right? And for someone like a Ramakrishna, what's he known for? He's just known for that universal love, for that universal wisdom, for always having the right words, and always his words have power because he has that inner integrity of truth. His deeds, his actions, and his thoughts are always in alignment. They're never contrary to each other. And so those great souls who have that level of power, they're remembered for thousands of years. We're still talking about them. Buddha, Chaitanya, Rama, Krishna, Ramakrishna, we're still talking about those folks after thousands of years. It's because the power, the manifestation in them was enormous. But the rest of us, we just get a little Energizer battery. We don't get the sun. And so that's the difference. That's how you explain the difference in that sense. All right. We're about to head into another day. Does anybody have a comment or a question about what we've looked at so far?
I do have, again, the same question. How do we get there?
Well, it's the wrong question, Rena. And that's why it's so difficult, because it's nowhere that we have to get. You have to accept the fact that you are there. And you have to find that perspective, that place of identity within yourself where that is true, right? All you have to do is stop using the mind and the senses to define yourself and begin to define yourself from the inside out. So look inside for who you are.
How do I do that?
Silence the mind. That's number one. Still the mind. Right? And all the practices, all the four paths, all the four yogas are the different methods of doing that, based on your disposition. So if you're a bhakti, sing the name of God continually. Practice seeing God when you look in the eyes of others. Practice addressing God in the eyes of others, and don't address the egos of others. See him in yourself. Through in your quiet practice, when you're chanting that name of God and you feel that bliss coming up inside, know that that's the presence of your beloved. And that love, which grows, will soon absorb you and your idea of God into a oneness. That love, that chanting of the name, calms the mind. Love is one of the few things that can calm the mind, because it occupies the whole mind in this reality, in this wonderful feeling or knowing of love, right? Love is love.
The practice of japam is what you mean also.
Yes. For the bhakti, those on the path of devotion, which is probably all of us, with some exceptions, but bhakti is basically it's saying the name of God, but paying attention to that which it invocates, that which it manifests. The name and form can't be different. So when you say the word of your mantra, when you say the name of God in your mantra, God is there. God and the mantra are one. And so as you continually say the mantra, each time you're trying to allow that to happen a little bit more. Each time you focus just a little bit more. And through that focus and through that trying to become aware of the presence of the mantra, the presence of God, that practice stills the mind. It gets the mind interested in a single thing, the name of God, the power of the divine, and that will absorb your ego self and your wrong idea of God into a new reality, into a reality of love that came out of chanting the name.
One more, Maharaj, when I'm by myself, I can do that. But when I'm with others and they're chatting, and that's when I can't do the japam.
Well,
at them as the divinity in them.
Yes, that's one way. The other one is you really can continue to do japam. You can do many types of thinking at a time. I mean, look at the number of things your body is doing. Your heart doesn't stop beating because you're distracted. You don't stop breathing because you're not thinking about it. So attach your mantra to those things. Attach your mantra to your breath, or attach your mantra to the beating of your heart, so that it's always going on, within you. But you're using the rest of your mind. Ramakrishna tells that story of the lady that works in the mill, right? He says that she's nursing her baby in one arm, she's giving a customer his proper change with the other arm, with the other hand, and in between doing that, she's reaching over and taking and putting fresh grain into the millstone to be ground into the flour, and she's collecting the flour into the bin. She's doing all of that at the same time. And so Ramakrishna is saying, be like that in the world. Do all of your duties. Take care of everything you have to take care of, but take 1/16 of your mind and keep it on God always.
Oh, Swami, it's an exception. We're not supposed to multitask, but we're allowed to put 1/16 of our mind on God.
Yeah, so that's Thakur gives us that permission because he said he's done for you the other 15/16.
Okay. Well, I'm noticing I can listen to this class and do my mantra.
Yes.
That's a brilliant idea or not? Not so sure, but it is possible.
Yeah, it's, and don't use the beginning aspects of it to judge it. Because at the beginning, it'll be difficult. But you'll find when the mantra catches fire in the mind, it starts happening all the time. It starts happening all the time. This happened to me. I told you the practice that allowed it to happen for me was when I was working before I became a monk. When I was working, and I would working in San Francisco, I was doing computer consulting. And because San Francisco is a pretty small town, small footprint of a city, I would walk between all of my clients. And when I would walk from one office to the other, I would always take out my japamala and I would do my japamala, but I linked it to my feet. Every time my right foot hit the ground, I would begin my mantra and I would finish it by the next time my right foot hit the ground and start again. So it was the memory mark was my right foot hitting the ground. And after I had done that for about 2 weeks, even to this day, and it's been 40, well, it hasn't been 40 years. It's been 20 years, 25 years, maybe 30. But anyway, here it is 25, 30 years later. If I do any kind of long walk or if I, walk over to the grocery store, I won't get to the end of the block before my mantra has started of its own accord in my mind, whether or not I was thinking about it or wanting to do it or not. It's just now it's been so locked in to my right foot hitting the ground, being the impetus to start the mantra, that it just goes. And so that's what happens. In time, we become tuned, that's the thing. And you don't have to
have do you have to have the mala with you while walking as well?
You don't have to. In the beginning, that's up to you. If it's helpful to you, use it. I find that even though I've been doing these practices for a long time, I find the mala to be very helpful. I can do it both ways. Certainly, you can sit down and meditate with no mala, or you can have the mala with you as you like. But I find that added thing of involving the body in the practice really helps me to bring my mind more to it. And it doesn't, and I'm more aware of wandering mind that way because I'm being held to a point by the movement of my hand.
Swami, to Rina's point, it is much more difficult when you're talking. Like I'm just quietly listening, but you're probably not doing your mantra while you're teaching us. Or
we don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's several things in there that's good for teaching, though. One is, yes, do less talking, no doubt. Do less, because you're not going to have a quiet mind if you don't have a quiet mouth.
If you're out with friends, you're not doing your mantra during, like, when you're sharing with them something interesting. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Or if, like, reading aloud, you are.
Well, see what you're telling me, though. See, this is a tough teaching, though, Rich. I know. But it's like, if we do things that distract us from God, that distract us from our goal, we hang out with noisy friends who don't like to talk about God. We hang out with people who are very interested in things that aren't spiritual. Then yes, we're going to be pulled into that company, and we're going to pay a price for that company. No, I'm not saying that you can't. I'm just saying choose things wisely.
No, Swami, you're not understanding. If I was going to read this book, if I was going to read this book aloud to you all, I wouldn't be doing my mantra while I'm reading aloud.
Well, yeah. I mean, yes, you would.
Okay.
but it becomes something different. The mantra becomes its own space within which you do things. So like, even though I'm not sitting here repeating the words of my mantra when I do this class, I am aware of what the mantra makes me aware of while I'm doing this class. Because I wouldn't dare open my mouth about most of this stuff if I didn't have an awareness of the presence of the divine at some level going on, that just an awareness that I made a deal with the Divine Mother, in 2012, when I gave my first lecture at the temple. My deal with Mother was, I said, Ma, this is absurd. That I've been asked to give up and stand up and give a lecture to a room of Vedantists who have been practicing longer than I have. I said, this is an absurdity. And so if you are going to insist on keeping me in this absurd position of teaching, I want the same deal that you gave Ramakrishna or to Vivekananda. Vivekananda described his relationship with the Divine Mother. She would put things in the back of his head and he would send them out of his mouth. And that's how it was. And so, yes, mantra becomes much more than just the repetition of a string of words. The mantra and God are not separate. And so the mantra invokes presence within you. And that presence will always be there. Okay. And everything that you do happens within the awareness of that presence. So yes, in time, mantra invokes and creates as normal space the presence of the beloved within you, the presence, the awareness of God within.
I got to do some more.
Yeah.
So sorry to Reena Didi asked you that question about silencing the mind. So I was just thinking, I'm just thinking aloud. I mean, it's very, you give some very good points. We know it, but we don't know it under the head, like silencing the mind, those little points, like you said, to see God in other people. So if we, because they say pictures speak a lot, like if for remembrance. So I was just thinking if we can have a little diagram, like silence the mind, few points under that. And then this leads to this, like a diagram. We have there's no diagram for, I mean, it'll keep us reminded all the time. You know what, Swami?
Well, yeah, you don't want to make it too complicated. You don't want a diagram. You just want to remember to think of God always. And if you're
do japa, then look and people look for, when you're talking to people, look for God in them. Like how to silence the mind. I mean, they all need to come they all need to come together for us to move forward. You know what I mean?
They will all follow the mantra.
Yeah.
So really the only thing that you have to do, the important thing is to do japam as often as possible, shooting for always, through all things. Make that the one thing that you work on, that you say japam throughout the day, with the idea that the goal is to say it all the time. Just do that. If you do that, that will invoke the presence. Once you've invoked the presence and an awareness of the presence within, all of the rest of the flowers will grow of their own accord. Wow. You don't have to run around and think I have to plant and do. You've got the sun and you've got the rain and you've got the soil just in the mantra. Just use the mantra. But when you say the mantra, try not to be rote about it. Try not to, it's between follow the instructions of your teacher for sure. But I'll share in my own practice, usually when I first sit down to meditate, I'll do it quite quickly in order to keep thoughts from barging in or coming in at the beginning. I get it going. Once I've kind of got it going, and I kindled a little bit of a fire of some bliss in there, some devotion going on inside, then it will slow down. I'll spend more time on the Om. Om. Om is wonderful in the heart. Wonderful in the heart. And so, I'll hold the Om a little bit longer, and I'll say the name very, very purposefully, very quietly, and just go. And then there are times when after I've gotten into the practice for a while, been sitting there for a bit of time, sometimes the mantra will pause of its own accord, almost as if it has become a prolonged, I don't know, what would you say? Almost like the silence has become the mantra. It's almost in that way. Om is filling the quiet. The mind is not wandering. The presence has become palpable to you. And there's just a sweetness there that sometimes you just sit and soak like a rasgola in the sugar syrup, and that's where we want to live. We want to live in that space, soaking in the rasgola syrup of God, the divine love. And so that it happens in many ways.
Well, that you had told me that I practiced, you said to remind me myself, I had to, write the sticky notes in the kitchen. I did that on the fridge and everywhere. If I forgot, I looked at it and it reminded me. And that really helped me.
Yes, that's the thing. The mantra is supposed to do that for us. But if we forget the mantra, we've got to take another step. And so to not forget the mantra, in Indian culture in particular, I'm talking as a third party to this. I don't know this for sure, but from my observations, I've shared this before about Indian culture, all of these rituals and all these rules, don't wear your shoes here, don't pick this up with that hand, don't put that knife there, don't put this over there. All that myriad of rules, the sages, that culture was created by the rishis, by the sages. And all of those rules were meant to keep you aware constantly of God. That was the point of them. It's not that God cares whether you touch his food with your left hand, or that God cares whether you wear shoes in the kitchen or not, or God cares whether, God obviously doesn't care at all about those things. So why all those rules? Well, all those rules are there for exactly what Rena just said. They're all there to remind you you're cooking for God. You're doing this for God. So they gave you all these rules to keep your mind constantly aware, so that you don't forget and just start rotely doing things.
I love that. Love that, Swami.
Yeah. But if what has happened over time for many people, not everybody, those rules have become important in and of themselves.
Yeah.
So somebody will scream their head off at you for walking into the kitchen with shoes on, but they haven't done a day's practice in 30 years. but they know all the rules, and they're going to make sure you obey them. And that's a dangerous place. That means ego has pretty much taken charge there and has calcified that practice into spiritual materialism, right? And there's not a lot of help in that. So, but yes, basically bottom line is, say your mantra as much as you can, all the time, if you can manage that. And if you can't manage that, then work on it, moving it in that direction. And when you're saying the mantra, understand that it's not different from God. That each time you say it, that God is more present within you than a moment before. And keep focusing on that. And then when the mantra starts happening of its own accord, you don't even have to think about it. Then you can literally walk around your mantra in the mind and begin to really, really plumb its depth, to no longer be thinking about the mantra, but be thinking about the invocation of the presence. And then not only to be invocating the presence, but that presence you link it to that which is becoming aware of the presence. Realize that the presence and that which is aware of the presence are the same. That is the I am in both conditions. The bliss, the joy is God on this side of the senses being recognized. But we don't want, the senses aren't what we want to be paying attention to. We don't want to be paying attention to the joy or to the bliss or whatever is going on inside. We don't want to pay attention to anything that's on the other side of the senses. What we do then is take that bliss that's there, and instead of seeing ourselves different from it, we see it as ourself. You see, this comes along later on, that you and that bliss, it's not you experiencing bliss, it's that you are bliss. You are Satchitananda, right? And so that's how slowly in that japam practice, the name makes us aware of ourself, of our true self. And in time, we become absorbed in that true self, which means we move our sense of identity out of the mind, out of the world of the changing, and into the heart, into the representation of the absolute unchanging within us.
So do you do it with the eyes closed, Swamiji, or open?